Welcome to part 3 of the trifecta digital storytelling episode with Disrupting Death. As we're moving into part 3, I want to do a shout out to the fabulous MAID Family Support Society. And I encourage our listeners, if you are not familiar with this great grassroots organization that connects peer-to-peer support in a unique way, please go check it out. Cynthia Clark, who has been a previous guest on our podcast, works closely with MAID Family Support, and you will have seen her book that she co-edited with a number of people who told their important stories called The Many Faces of MAID. So that is one of the things that is affiliated with MAID Family Support that was started by Sig Novak. This organization is growing, and we are very grateful to Sig and the team at MAID Family Support for supporting our research and helping us to gain the fabulous connections we did for the creators of the digital stories that you are going to see with this part 3. Also, you're going to hear from two fabulous digital story facilitators, Krystle and Maureen, about their experiences. They work with Common Language with Dr. Mike Lang. So let's move our conversation forward and let's chat a bit with Krystle and Maureen. Welcome, Krystle and Maureen. Thank you so very much for being such an important part of our project. Let's start, Krystle, by asking you a question. I'm interested in hearing what brought you both to digital storytelling. What captured your interest?
I come from a photography background. In the last, 10 years or so, I started entering the world of documentary family photography, largely because of my experience as a mother and sort of seeing how few photos really captured the reality of parenthood. And also a lot of the time I wasn't in the photos because I was taking them. And as I had my second child who was born with a rare disease, I really found that photography was a powerful way for me to process the experience. A lot of people go through difficult medical experiences and don't take any pictures. I was the opposite. I took pictures every single day. It was a way for me to process what I went through at the time, but also like down, into the future, looking back at the images and gaining new understanding. So when I learned about digital storytelling, I felt like it was a really natural next step or addition to the work that I was already doing visually, because we're now taking images and including a narrative. I think the ability to be able to work with people to help them tell their stories is really powerful. So that's sort of what brought me into the digital storytelling realm as a facilitator, and initially kind of doing work within the rare disease community, because I feel like there are many stories in all of these communities that are not being told. And, I went into sort of documenting life on a daily basis in home with rare disease families to show what living at home was like. And now it's really cool to be able to expand that, out of the rare disease world, but into all these other projects.
Thank you, Krystle. And how about you, Maureen?
Yeah, so my professional background is in nursing, and I was able to work in a pediatric intensive care unit where you can imagine there would be a lot of intense stories, and then also able to work with some of those same families in the community via a respite and education program. So those same families I was able to follow into the community and be in their homes and see the full context, which was exceptionally humbling and eye-opening from a health professional point of view. So that was sort of simmering in the background. And then I had a friend who was doing this work, and I found myself being a voracious reader, loving media, storytelling in general. I found myself getting so excited about what she was doing. And then I went, wow, like I really want to do this. This is actually something I want to do. And so took a course with Mike. And then through that experience, saw exactly how transformational the work can be, having personally experienced it.
Thank you. And so both of you have worked with Mike and done digital storytelling workshops before. So I'm interested, how did what we were doing as part of this research project differ, or how was it the same from other digital storytelling workshops that you've been involved in?
There were a lot of similarities, actually. So the group that I've mainly worked with is Wellspring Alberta. So I worked with people who had either been on a cancer journey or were supporting somebody on a cancer journey. And there are similar components of bringing people together who have had a somewhat similar experience, but obviously very specific to their lived experience. So we'd start to see common themes emerge around the population. And I did definitely notice certain themes emerging through all the storytellers that were specific to MAID. And that was really definitely very interesting to see these commonalities emerging in terms of that lived experience, which was really eye-opening for me.
Can you give me an example, Maureen? What were some of the commonalities or the themes?
From what I observed, this sort of parallel experience where it was impossible to fully make it your story without paralleling it to the loved one's experience, and how different those experiences were. You know, a lot of the narrative was at the moment the decision is made, there's a lot of relief for the person who's made the decision. The people supporting that loved one, their relationship to that can feel overwhelming, and the reality hits, and their relationship to time is very specific. And the moment where that person goes from living to not living is very specific and unique to a MAID death versus supporting a loved one who's dying a different kind of death. So those are the main points that I've noted, but I'll pass it to Krystle. She might have other observations.
Thanks, Maureen. I think you covered a lot of it. I noticed a lot of connection happening. Like, one of the amazing parts of running these workshops is the community that forms within them. And that is something that I've seen in other workshops as well. Some of the other workshops I've worked on have not been one common theme. They've been sort of a group of people coming together to tell different stories. And so even though we all are sharing different experiences, there's still that connection that happens going through the process of creating a digital story together, because it's a vulnerable space. And, I think ultimately we're all pausing to listen. We're all pausing to listen and give our focus to someone's experience, which is unique in our world these days. We don't always take that time. And so I think that's unique for the storytellers and for all of us involved in it as facilitators or other participants.
As co-facilitators of these digital stories, what do you hope are some of the things that people take from those stories or learn from the experiences?
Yeah, I think from my experience with the stories in general, it just starts conversations. It just gets people talking. My own personal experience with, practicing with my parents when I was still learning. I mean, we had conversations we never would have had otherwise. And not via a MAID death, but my father has now died. And what an opportunity, what an amazing opportunity for people to have these different types of conversation, to find connection. They're actually moments of awe. I think it's Dacher Keltner who talks about awe. And he actually talks about awe as one of the moments of awe at his brother's bedside as he was dying, right? So to kind of acknowledge these bittersweet moments, if done with ritual and compassion and kindness, it makes the difference between a moment of awe and something that feels isolating and terrifying, So yeah, we're just innate storytellers. And I think this is just another vehicle that's exceptionally powerful in terms of creating community and starting conversations.
Yeah, I fully agree, Maureen. I think it's all about the conversation and the connection and, and the new understanding, right? New understanding of something you may, especially with MAID, may not be well understood across the general public. To be able to really hear what it meant for individuals to have access to MAID. I mean, for me as a facilitator, that was really powerful going through this workshop, to hear the sort of common experience of relief that they had access to MAID. I had a number of storytellers say, we could start living again, for the time we had left, because we knew we had this as an option. And I think those are some of the sort of behind the scenes things that we don't always hear, what's actually happening in the home and what's actually happening in the relationships in people's lives. To be able to hear that is such a unique experience. And I'm just so grateful for the storytellers to have stepped forward and been open to being vulnerable and sharing these beautiful stories.
Agreed. Very grateful that they were willing and well supported and well cared for throughout this process to be able to create those stories. And now we will get to hear from the digital story creators themselves. And first up, we're going to speak with Robin Farr, who's going to be talking about the digital story she created, Writing the Ending. Thank you so very much for joining us. I'm interested in just starting off, why did you agree to create a digital story?
There were two reasons for me. One is I have been involved with this MAID world for a while, since my dad used MAID in 2021. And it's become a big passion of mine in terms of just sharing the story of the experience, connecting with others who've been through it, and in doing so, providing a bit of support for people. So that was kind of the primary motivation, was to be able to continue to share the story. The other reason, though, is that it just sounded like a cool experience.
Good to hear. I was going to ask you, so did it live up to your expectations then?
Yeah, and even more so, actually. I wasn't really sure what to expect going in, but it was a really fun experience. I was a bit anxious coming in because this is obviously kind of a hard story to tell. But the way that it got put together and the encouragement and the suggestions that were provided around how to do it actually made it a lot easier than I was expecting. And it was kind of nice to put the story together and tell a slightly different version of the story than what I typically do.
I love that. And I also love, Robin, that you have called the process fun. I know for me personally, I cried at least 4 different times. And so you have just called an experience where there was a lot of tears shared. And I've heard from other people that sometimes they pulled their hair out a little bit with their process. My phrase, not theirs. How was it still fun?
It's funny that you say that, because the first night we got together, I was the biggest crier of the group. And actually, I had a moment in that thinking, what did I get myself into? I don't know if I can do this. So the first night was hard. And I went into the second part of the process, which was writing the story. And I really thought, I can't do this. And the writing the story piece, where that becomes the voiceover, I thought there's no way I'm going to be able to do this without sobbing all the way through. It's going to be totally useless. Spoiler, I did manage to do that without crying. But it was fun for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was just a fun group of people. And there was the recognition that this was a hard thing to do. And in doing so, that kind of created a bit of freedom for it to just be hard and to let us work through that process, which was great. But storytelling seems like such an overused word, but I love that stuff. It's a process that I have used for myself, mostly in writing, as a way of processing stuff and sharing my experiences and hopefully putting some information out there that helps other people. And the idea of bringing together the written piece for me, which I have done a lot, and the visual side was really cool. It was just different. It was neat. It was fun to be able to play with the imagery and the sound and the music and all of that stuff to create a story that was what I had written, and to create the visual element of that. So I love creative stuff like that. It is fun for me. It was kind of neat. It was also really hard. It was emotional and it was gratifying, and all of those things. Fun was in there for sure.
I really appreciate what you shared, Robin. I love that idea of holding those two things simultaneously, right? Fun and hard. Not fun, but hard, because hard things are hard, but they have bright moments. So, when people come to a point where they are going to watch your story, do you have any sense of what you'd like people to take away from the story that you created about your dad?
This might sound ridiculous, but I came into this thinking of telling my story of my experience. And what it ended up being was actually a story about my dad. Obviously that was what it was about, but I was going into it thinking this was going to be about my MAID experience. And the piece that I got hung up on was the day that my dad died. That was the piece. I couldn't do it. I couldn't write it. And Mike finally said to me, you don't have to write that part. It doesn't have to be part of your story. And I thought, oh, of course. Okay, that makes a ton of sense. And so what I ended up doing was just telling a story about my dad. And through the process of, collecting the stories that I wanted to share about him and the images, I sort of got to live with that aspect of him and who he was. And my story is about him being a storyteller. And he really was. And that was who he was. And he had stories and jokes. And that was kind of the person that he was. And I think that's just the thing that is really nice for me to be able to share with people is I'm happy to share my MAID experience if that helps other people. But it's so nice to be able to share the story of my dad and who he was and what he was like and how he used all of the pieces of who he was in making this decision to choose MAID and control his own destiny in that way. And as I say in the story, finish his story in the way that he wanted to finish it.
Yeah, I think that's incredible. And I get the impression that you were kind of given permission to tell the story that you felt like you wanted to tell.
Yeah, definitely. The most freeing part of this was when early on in the process, the point was made that this was not your story. It is a story. It is not the entirety of your story. It is an element of your story. And that was really freeing to me because with this being such a personal experience, you want to share all the parts of it and you want people to really understand what it was like. And of course, you can't do that no matter the medium. It's not possible to do that. But with this, we were able to figure out what that was. And the first day where we came in and each of us shared our story, and we just sort of talked a little bit about the experience. And then the others kind of went through the process of picking out the themes that they heard and what they thought the crux of the story was and the kind of imagery that was coming to them. That really narrowed it down for me and was able to help me get to a point where we could really understand what it was that I wanted to share. And so it really became this piece of, oh, I can share whatever aspect of this I want. And so, the story that I usually tell as part of this experience didn't even come into it. It is a totally different story. And I think in some ways a more well-rounded one because it's not just about my experience, but it's about my dad's experience and what he chose as well. So it really was that freeing piece of being able to say, I'm going to take this piece that is maybe the crux of my experience and set it aside, obviously the day that he died, and tell the bigger picture of who he was and what that journey was like for him and therefore also for me.
Very cool. Is there something that telling your story in this way was a catalyst for you to learn something different about your experience?
Yes, I think in probably a few different ways. So the piece of the story that I often get into when people ask me what that was like to have him choose that, I always say I got up on the morning that he was due to die and threw up. And that was sort of I think that says so much to me about what that experience was like. It was just overwhelming and awful and all of those things that you go into with this day that's just something that you can never really prepare for. And in setting that piece aside and in telling a different version of this story, I think I got to the piece about how powerful this was as a decision for my dad, how clear he was that this was what he wanted and what he needed, and how much we all supported him in making that decision. We always did. We never really had any questions about that, even if we didn't really want it or we didn't want it to happen at the time that it did. But this process really reinforced to me all of the things about who he was and how he got to this point in his life where this was the right decision to him. And we also, we talked a little bit about the sort of the leading up to that day and what we did and some of the pieces that kind of came through in remembering those last days with him that were actually really, obviously, again, really hard and also really, meaningful and emotional and kind of funny because my dad had all of these stories and jokes and the day before we died, we sat in his long-term care room and he retold some of them and we got to laugh at those stories again. And it reminded me of that stuff, which in the overwhelm of the experience sometimes gets lost.
And I love that those pieces aren't lost, that they come back and that digital storytelling provided you and I think a few others in the group with a different way, a different lens, a different, perception of a story. And so I am very grateful that you participated, Robin. And can I ask, would you recommend digital storytelling to someone else who has accompanied someone who used MAID at the end of their lives?
I would recommend it 100%. It is such a neat process and such a cathartic process of going through this piece. And then at the end, you get this thing that you get to keep and share with people, which is a beautiful thing.
Next up, we are speaking with Sigrid Bjarnason. Her digital story is titled Dreams of You. Thank you so much for joining us, Sigrid. I just want to start us off by asking, why did you say yes to creating a digital story when you were asked? What did you think the process was going to be like? And did it live up to what you thought?
Well, I decided to say yes because one of my strong feelings is that I want people to know that when somebody has Alzheimer's or some kind of dementia, that they are eligible to apply for MAID. So I said yes for that selfish reason of getting that word out there a little bit more, because obviously some people are going to see it that wouldn't otherwise know about that. Also, I think it's a profound process to go through somebody's illness, a spouse's illness and death. And in my opinion, it's helpful to dive into those emotions rather than ignore them, that it helps to come to terms with all that by digging into the emotions, and certainly by writing a story about it and going through all the pictures, that is, definitely something that I thought might be helpful to me in terms of coming to terms with it all and being able to carry on with my life a little bit afterwards.
Those are very strong motivations, and letting people know that it's possible to be approved for MAID when you have Alzheimer's disease is an important message. And I think that's one that comes across clear in your digital story. Who do you hope will listen to your digital story, and what kind of messages do you hope they might receive?
Well, I've already shown it to over 40 people, and I am going to get involved in a couple of events just to do with MAID. And we're going to show the story and, open it up for discussion. And so there's about 3 locations now that are possible for me to do that. So whoever's interested will hear about it. I think there are a lot of people who, especially older people, who are interested in the topic. And so I hope lots of people see it and learn something from it. And what do I want them to learn? I think my husband, as you can tell from this story, was planning to end his own life, which would have been horrible for me and horrible for him. And so the fact that he had such a peaceful death, I hope people get what an improved exit that was. He got to leave when he wanted to. And so to me, that, the contrast and thinking about how the end of his life could have been is just like, I'm so grateful that was a choice. And so I want people to know that it can be a lovely death.
To have your digital story viewed by at least 40 people already, Sigrid, is not a small feat. We're a few months having completed the digital stories. Can I ask, what kind of feedback are you getting from people?
I think people feel very touched by it. I've had a lot of people say, that's beautiful. I'm going to cry. So glad you did this. Thank you for sharing it. To the people that I've shown it to knew about Alzheimer's and MAID. So it wasn't about that. It was just the fact that I got to talk about my husband's life before he had Alzheimer's. And for me, that was really important to show that he had a lot of abilities and skills, and he had a good life, and, it just slowly chipped away. But I think people were really touched by the people that knew him, remembering back to what it used to be like and what he used to be able to do, and, the person that he was.
Thank you. I think that's really important. I get a real sense from you, Sigrid, that going out into community with your story and affording people the opportunity to lean in and to learn from you is something that's very important to you.
So, Sigrid, would you recommend digital storytelling to someone?
Oh, definitely. I think it was a really helpful process for working through emotions. I think a lot of people, when somebody dies, feel like they need a purpose, and, that the death shouldn't be in vain, kind of. Or so, that's part of what helps me, is to think, okay, well, here's something positive I can do with this very difficult experience. And, the MAID part that was the easy part, right? The disease was the hard part, and the MAID part, well, it was difficult to arrange, but the actual death was, so, so lovely, in comparison to what it could have been, that I'm just thrilled to have been able to do this. Actually, I would definitely recommend it to people for whatever their purposes or needs are. It's definitely helps you work through emotions.
Thank you for that, Sigrid. I agree. I made my digital story literally for that reason, because I just didn't know what to do with this need to express emotion, and I couldn't figure out how to do that. So digital storytelling for me was definitely a catalyst for me to navigate a lot of that and try to figure out, because you used a phrase that really resonated, about my uncle did not have MAID, but he died during the pandemic, and couldn't figure out how I was going to make sense of his death in this kind of weird capsule of what we were all living within. Excellent. Thank you.
Next up, we have the privilege of speaking with Trish Heidebreck Archibald, and her digital story is titled Both Sides, A Chaplain's MAID Story. Trish, so glad you could join us today.
So happy to be here. Thanks.
And of course, we so appreciated your willingness to create a digital story as part of our research project. And so, Trish, I'm interested, what inspired you to create a digital story and say yes to that?
Oh, well, I found out about the project, the Digital Stories Project, through my work with the MAID Family Support Society. And it just seemed to be a natural kind of follow through to an impulse that I had when I was receiving some support after my husband had died. And I just needed to talk to somebody who understood the MAID journey as a person who supported their loved one. And I knew at that point, when I had received some help through the MAID Family Support Society, that I wanted to do this someday too. So that's how I ended up being a volunteer with them. And then this invitation to share the story, I realized that each of our stories have, individual characteristics to them that may speak to somebody else, even like it's our own personal story. But our themes and our experiences can so often be shared, be translated between people's stories. And I thought, if there's one little bit of my own journey that helps somebody else say, oh, yeah, me too. And boy, am I ever glad to know I'm not alone. That was really my first line motivation for doing this.
I hear that loud and clear, Trish. And I'm wondering, thinking about the digital story process and getting together with the group to create your individual stories, but yet had some common themes, was there something that surprised you from that process?
Yes. The thing that surprised me was how much more, from my own personal perspective, was how much more of the story there was still to tell within me. I'm 3 years out from my husband's MAID death and, have gone through a lot of the typical grieving kind of process. A lot of my life has sort of carried on in different directions. And I thought that I was pretty well not done my grieving because I don't know that we ever completely finish our grieving. But I thought that the story was pretty well tucked in and finished. This opportunity to be able to dive deep into the story and explore it in a way that involved some creative writing, images, music, talking it through with the other participants in the group was really deeply engaging in a way that I hadn't expected before and really healed some parts that I hadn't realized were still kind of fractured in there that I needed to really be able to kind of look at and then be able to articulate in some way.
Thanks, Trish, for that. I really love that. I jotted that down about how much more to the story that you perhaps needed to be processed. I really like that. There was left to tell as well. And I want to kind of zero in on that left to tell because you did mention at the beginning of our conversation about being involved because almost like a give back, right? What are some of the things that I have experienced that I can perhaps share so that somebody out there doesn't necessarily feel alone in what they're navigating? So, that being said, you've produced this digital story. What are you hoping that audiences take away from your story about your experience and about John's experience with MAID?
I guess as I started to formulate what my story actually was, because on one level, I was John's wife, just supporting him and his decisions and loving him through that process. But I realized that it was within the wider context, the wider framework, the bigger framework of me working within healthcare as a spiritual care provider and my own previous experience with MAID supporting other families played into how I ended up then when the time came for me to be in their shoes, how I experienced the whole MAID journey as well. And I guess what I would hope comes out of this, for me personally, it's made me, I think, a far better care provider for people who are going through the journey, for somebody to be able to companion somebody through that time without judgment. But I also hope that people listening to my story can find some reassurance that struggling with the spiritual themes that go on throughout the decision, our loved ones' decisions to choose MAID, that we can talk about these things and that we don't have to be afraid of them or feel judged by them, that there's an open and safe forum to be able to talk about spiritual themes.
when it comes down to talking about MAID. And I guess that's where my story sort of is just a little bit different because that's the water I swim in all the time, and hoping that invite other people to jump in with me.
And I suspect that they will when they see your story. And that was one of the very beautiful pieces that I appreciated about your digital story was the spirituality piece. And I think it will stimulate many important conversations when people have the chance to view your story, Trish. And I'm wondering if you were to pick one person, one individual, who might that person be, who that you really want to listen to your story?
I guess I imagine a person who worries deeply about the implications of choosing MAID on a spiritual level. So whether it's themselves choosing MAID, deciding to choose MAID, worrying, is God going to be mad? Or, how can I support my loved one if I spiritually, theologically think that somehow that this is wrong? How do I make that transition of love just in loving my person through this, even if I've got questions about things spiritually myself? That would be the person that I would want to have more of a conversation with. And I hope that my story can kind of lead into that conversation.
That's what I hope too, Trish. And I suspect strongly for those people who view it that they'll review it a few times and sit with some of those strong messages in your digital story. And I'm also hopeful that we will have a number of people who are challenged by the themes that come across in the digital stories.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think it really speaks to that idea that Kathy and I encounter with our participants, but also in the roles that we play in the wider context, that how someone dies matters and how someone dies matters for our grief. And I think what you're talking about is this, I'm going to use a word that's indicative of my Catholic upbringing, but that absolution that we're able to have, in the sense that I love what you said about letting love lead, perhaps in those instances, because, we have heard things, and I've heard things anecdotally from people who carry a burden of guilt or questioning or inner judgment or whatever because of those. Where does my compass sit on all of this? And how do I feel about all this? And did I do the right thing for my person, but not for my higher being, et cetera? So I really appreciate that you made that connection. I think that will be very helpful for a lot of people.
When it comes down to it, I think, all of the spiritual conversations around MAID usually are, some of those stories that we've integrated over the years, especially if we've grown up in a fairly rigid kind of theological structure, right? Where, we start thinking about, what is the purpose of suffering? I think is what it comes down to, and life and death. Like there's that on that one hand, there's the, that being that gives you life and determines the length of your life. And, we only die when it's our time. And our time is, somehow decided by this higher power. And that somehow suffering for all of that gets wrapped into this idea that it's instructive somehow, that we're taught something or that there is a purpose to our suffering. So when you go down that path, right, then there's this whole idea of, is there sort of a redemptive part of suffering, like to stick through it all the way? And, people really get stuck there in saying, like, does God kind of want me to suffer? And then on the other hand, we've got people who are saying, like, what if we're more in a partnership with God, that we've been given life and it's the back and forth with a relationship kind of thing that says that God doesn't send us suffering to teach us anything, but suffering simply part of being human. It's part of being alive. And, there's times where our bodies are going to break or die long before we're ready to be done. Or sometimes our bodies carry on long after we are so ready to be done with it. And that's, the suffering part of it then becomes, if we're thinking sort of spiritually, does God suffer along with us and not desire our suffering, but understand our suffering? And so for people who choose MAID, with that in mind, it's not kind of, thumbing their nose at God and saying, hey, I'm going to get out of here, even though you think I should be sticking around longer. But it's this idea of, being so incredibly grateful for the life that we have that, we're saying with all love and gratitude and thanks, like, but I am so tired. I'm giving this back. I want to give this back. And thank you, but I'm done. And that's what I saw play out in front of me with John's story, is that he was the son of a minister. I mean, he had grown up with all of this. And yet at the end, he just said, I think that God is saying to me, come on, you're tired. It's time to come home. And that there would be nothing there that would be, are you going to be judged in the final day for these decisions that you've made to sort of preempt God's role somehow? And that's where I chose to land, because that speaks to my heart. I could support my husband in his decision with fullness of heart and just say that surely as I love him, he is also loved by God, his God. And, that this was a place that he could rest. And that, maybe people won't agree with me on that. Theologically, there's lots of space there. There thinks that there's lots of places to argue otherwise, but that's where I've ended up having to find my peace in all of that as a religious leader and a hospital chaplain and as a wife.
That speaks to my heart too, Trish. Thank you. Yeah. And to be able to capture some of those pieces within a digital story and then to be willing to share it with others is an amazing gift. And so thank you, Trish, for speaking with us today.
Thank you,
And
Trish.
for creating a beautiful healing story.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today. The whole process has been just such a tremendous gift. And thank you for the work that you're doing.
Continuing on with our fabulous digital story creators, next up, we have Dave Burns, who's talking about his digital story, Notes from Annie. Dave, we're so glad you could speak with us today. I'm interested, Dave, why did you agree to create a digital story? What was your motivation?
I guess I had a couple of motivations. One was the technology. It's always been interesting to me, the process of making a video. So it was wonderful to learn the software and to use it, be able to juggle everything, put things in place. But the main reason was I felt it was important to get the message out that there is a thing called MAID, that often it's a huge relief to people, both to the person who is in line to have MAID and to whoever's doing the supporting, that they do not have to end their life in pain and they can decide for themselves when they've had enough.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I want to, of course, unpack some of your thoughts about medical assistance in dying and the creation of the story. But I just want to acknowledge that you are probably the first person I've talked with, Dave, who said the technology part of digital stories was appealing to them. Because often we have the flip side of that. People have a story, but they're a little bit scared about the technology thing. So tell me a little bit about you in terms of your interest in the technological part of digital story creating and how did it go for you?
Well, I'm a guy, right?
And we're going to talk a little bit more about that too, but continue.
Yeah. So that has a lot to do with it. Well, I've been doing photography for decades. It just seems like an extension. I watch YouTube videos quite a bit. It's just interesting. So I had Photoshop elements in a package that came with Premiere. I think it's called Premiere Elements, which is putting videos together. And I've never been able to make it through the documentation to figure out how to do it. But this has really kind of broken the ice, if you will. It's not that daunting.
That is fabulous to hear. And it's great when people, volunteer their time, energy, and share their story and come away with some skills that serve them moving forward. And so I'm going to follow up on the guy thing now about the identification of the man piece. And so people who are going to be listening to this episode and seeing the digital stories are probably going to know that you were, Dave, the sole male participant in our stories. Mike Lang, who we will also hear from, facilitated the different groups. But I'm going to be honest, we were challenged to get men to come and join us to make digital stories. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I'm involved with MAID Family Support Society, right? And early on, my constant question was, where are all the men? I don't have any answers. I think it's a cultural thing that a lot of men are not comfortable talking about love and grief.
And we see it too. And I'm going to acknowledge that not solely in the digital storytelling realm, we're also seeing it in our focus groups and people who participate for interviews as well.
Yeah.
And for our listeners who listen to our podcast, they'll notice we primarily speak with women. It's not a purposeful thing. It's just those are the people who answer our call, and there tends to be more women talking about medical assistance in dying and love and grief as you highlight that. So I hope, Dave, one of my wishes with your story is that maybe we'll get more men engaged in the conversations.
I would like for that to happen for sure. I don't think there's anything to be frightened of.
Yeah. And again, I'm hopeful that's what people are going to take from the stories, right? And I love how you talk about it as being a story of love and grief, because that is definitely something I got from your story and many of the stories that people are going to be able to access as well. And we know that defies gender, age, cultural background. Love and grief are universal experiences.
Yeah.
Agreed. Yes.
So that's exciting because, you being a trailblazer, Dave, and possibly feeling all the feels, but wanting to move forward anyway. My question for you, Dave, has to do with any kind of takeaways you might want. So that's in keeping with what we've just discussed. I'm sensing that my hope from your story is that because you are the author of your story, that some men, people who identify as men, might say, okay, well, Dave's done it and I've listened and I've heard that voice and, representation is really important. Are there any specific takeaways that you're hoping audiences will take away in general from your story?
I hope from my story and from other stories and from podcasts that people will realize that they're not alone, that many men and women have gone through this experience. Yeah.
And I think that's really important. We have heard from a number of people that was their motivation, to show people that they weren't alone in this. And can I ask, Dave, did you feel alone while you were creating your story?
Absolutely not. It was a wonderful experience. The sessions that we had over the 5 weeks, I think it was, it really felt like a very cohesive group, a lot of support for each other and encouragement. Yeah.
Would you recommend digital storytelling to people?
Oh, for sure. Doing it with the group was just terrific. Yeah, I loved it. It was tough. I will say that it was really hard. I don't think a week went by that I thought I can't do this, but I'm really glad that I hung in, and I'm quite proud of what I ended up with.
And you should be. And Dave, I'm excited to hear from people when they view your story and see that love story and the grief after your wife accessed MAID. And incredibly grateful that you took a chance and hung out with a group of, dare I say, fabulous women for 5 weeks. And Mike, we of course can't forget Mike. And took the time to craft your story and develop a new skill set. So thank you so very much, Dave.
Thank you.
Regular listeners will recognize the voice of our next guest, Cynthia Clark. Cynthia is going to be talking about her digital story entitled Fatherless Daughters. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this, Cynthia. So I just want to start off by asking, what motivated you to do a digital story?
I had seen Sig Novak's digital story, and I think they're quite powerful and moving. I think stories are kind of the heart of how we reach people's hearts. And I do a lot of presenting about MAID Family Support Society, about MAID itself. I volunteer with Dying Dignity and present about end-of-life choices, and I'm frequently telling my story. And I think there is an element of emotion required to do that every time, to go there, and a lot of emotional hangover from going there. And although I tell it a lot, I thought this would be a great way to kind of have it in the most impactful and succinct way for when, maybe days you're not on or don't feel like digging deep for those reserves. Or days, you don't want to be there, but your story can still live on and touch other people's hearts.
I like that term emotional hangover. And I have seen some of your social media posts, Cynthia, about the emotional hangover or the pain that is caused by telling your story over and over again for the benefit of others. And I know that is part of your goal and your motivation with all the work that you are doing. But how do you take care of yourself doing that? And specifically, how did it feel around the digital story? Because I think that was an opportunity for vulnerability, if we can call it that as well.
Yeah, I struggled with the digital story work. It was really intense and emotional, and I have young kids and I don't always like have the reserves. So how do I take care of myself? I hate that question, Kathy. Sometimes I don't, let's be honest.
And
You
I knew
know?
you'd be honest, Cynthia, which is, I'm sorry.
I
I
know.
hate the question too, but thank you, because I want to normalize the fact that sometimes we
I
don't.
know. Yeah,
And
sometimes we just don't. Sometimes we just have to keep on going. And I think that part of the reason I tell my story so much or I'm willing to go there so much is I have young kids and that's their story. And it's this double-edged sword of it's also their privacy. But, going there ensures that we keep their past alive and we keep their father alive and we remember what we've been through and who we used to have. And it also I think normalizes for my kids that it's okay that it still hurts 5 years later. It's normal that it's hard to talk about sometimes. It's easy to talk about other times. It's like kind of trying to walk the talk so that I can help make sure they're also well and healthy. And how do I care for myself? In the summer, I go to my cabin as often as I can, prioritize going to nature.
excellent. And yes, it's a difficult question, but I think people will want to know, Cynthia, because as you know, the interview that you did with us on our podcast is a very powerful one. People talk about that regularly. And I know that's only one very tiny piece of the advocacy and the telling of your story that you've done. And now you've created this digital story. And thank you for acknowledging that it wasn't easy, because we've heard that from a number of people. And I also think that acknowledging that 5 years post the death of your husband, it should still hurt. And we need to talk more about that we don't get over grief.
Yeah, we don't.
No, no.
We take it with us.
Yeah, we take it with us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious, we talk about wanting to share a heartfelt message with others. What do you hope the message people get from your digital story?
Ooh. I think that my story kind of illustrates that I went through something that was really hard, becoming a widow young and when my kids were young. And people often look at me with these puppy dog eyes like, oh my God, or not puppy dog, pity eyes of kind of how awful and hard that was. But that doesn't mean that I can relate to or understand other people's grief or other people's stories. I didn't know what it was like to lose a father until just 6 months ago. And I still don't know what it's like to lose a mother or a best friend. And so I hope that people learn from my story that grief is hard and loss is hard for everyone. And everyone sits in a different seat for every loss. And the losses are different and they might look comparable from different situations, but only the person who's experiencing the loss can know what it feels like. And one day you'll have an aha moment of how someone else was feeling. Like my story sort of centers around comparing my daughter losing her father to me then losing mine and not knowing what it was like for her until it happened to me.
Yeah, I really love that, Cynthia, because I've written down everyone sits in a different seat for every loss, which I think is poignant as I know you to be, but also staying on, right? Absolutely. And I really appreciate too that if we're done with the stages of grief or the phases of grief, then I want to be done with the chronology of grief. Well, 6 years out, why is she still signing Christmas cards with her husband's name? And I'm like, stop using numbers, man. There's no number. We don't need a number. So my question for you, based on what you've shared with us today, is would you have any advice for another person who had accompanied someone through the MAID process for them embarking on a digital story project?
Yeah, I would say clear your calendar. before and after a workshop appointment so that you have time to scramble before, but then also process your emotional hangover after. I would also say do it, no matter how far out you are, that there's always grief to process and things to think about. And it's like hard but important. Kind of like the roller coaster. It's like scary, but it's awesome,
Yeah, I love that too, because of course the roller coaster featured in your story. So I love that you kind of, that
That was not
image.
intentional.
Yeah, no, but there it was somewhere in the subconscious. So that being said, having told your story, having written your story, having digitized your stories, did anything surprise you?
I've been surprised at my reluctance to share it in ways I thought I would. It is really personal and I shared it, but I haven't shared it as publicly as I thought I might. Like I haven't posted it on social media or posted it publicly on the website. And every time I watch it, I cry.
Thank you for saying that, Cynthia, because as the lead for this project, I know that there has been a lot of desire to get the stories out as quickly as possible. And one of the things that I've learned is that we need to slow and press a little bit of pause and let people have their stories for a bit. It's your story. I want you to hold on to it and figure out how you want to use it before we do something like we are now with the podcast a few months later. And I'm eternally grateful for you have taken all the steps to engage with our work that you've done, but also to really lean in hard with the pieces and then to reflect on it to help us learn as we move through it. And finally, last but definitely not least, we have Lorraine Thomas, who's joined us to talk about her digital story titled Broken Things. So thanks for joining us this morning, Lorraine. I'm interested in just starting off, what motivated you to create a digital story?
Ooh, well, I found the whole idea a bit intriguing. It seemed like a good opportunity to document our story and have it, for a long time.
Yeah, and something to hold and to keep. So what was the process like for you in terms of the documenting of your story?
It was challenging. I guess I knew going in that it was going to be, but yeah, the process was, certainly rewarding, but also challenging, digging into that experience and reliving it and trying to convey a story about Michael that was the right story, there's so many ways to do it. So I really had to dig deep.
Yeah. And I'm interested, Lorraine, because sometimes when we have been talking about digital stories, people will say, oh, I'd never want to do that because the technology knowledge that's required. But when I asked you about the challenges, you didn't mention technology. You went into the sharing of your story and sharing the right story of Michael. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, certainly there was some technology challenges. It was a bit intimidating. But no, it was definitely more an emotional challenge for me to, relive those days leading up to his passing. I think a lot of people like to just kind of compartmentalize and put that away and try to move on. And having been in this sort of therapeutic world before all of this, I knew that probably wasn't the healthiest way. So, that was part of me accepting doing this is to, work through it. While making the story.
I think that's such a valid comment, Lorraine, because I think we are inclined to sort of say, okay, that was that space, that time, and it becomes this capsule. And so what you're suggesting is, you knowing that you were delving back into the capsule might be a rough ride, but it was a necessary ride for your own kind of healthy grief.
Yeah, and it certainly, I don't know that there's ever permanent closure, but it certainly gave me a feeling of closure completing it.
Sharing your thoughts with us today, that might lead somebody to want to watch your story, yours and Michael's story. What are you hoping somebody who watches your story takes away from the story that you chose to tell?
I guess just that you don't stay in that place forever. There is movement through it and
the experience of grief does morph and does ease, and you can find life after this experience.
And that is such an important and generous message to share with people. And particularly because, Lorraine, what you said earlier really resonated with me, that I believe that we don't ever truly have so-called closure with our grief experience. When we have loved someone, we continue to figure out how to live our lives with them not being physically present anymore. And I think your story for me was an example of that. So I hope that's what people take away from it as well. And so again, I just want to say thank you, Lorraine, for sharing your story, for finding that right story that you wanted to tell about you and Michael together.
I wanted to thank you for making space to make your story, because I know you had things happening in your life. You welcomed a new little person onto the planet while you were in the project with us.
Yeah, thank you. I think that experience of welcoming my grandson during that, it was a real sort of full circle kind of moment, talking about loss and then having birth included in that experience. It was kind of beautiful.
Kind of beautiful. Absolutely. Thank you, Lorraine.
I have to say, this research project, the creation of these digital stories, have been something I personally will never forget. And so to every single digital story creator, to Mike and the team, Maureen and Krystle at Common Language, to the research team that I have the privilege of collaborating with, Keri, Lynn, and Sadie, and Arne and Kim, my most heartfelt gratitude. So please, dear listener, go and check out these digital stories from our website onto the YouTube channel, and then connect with us. Let us know what you thought. Drop us an email on disruptingdeath.ca or connect with us on the multitude of socials where we sometimes spend time on, including Facebook, Instagram, and most of us are on LinkedIn. And of course, dear listener, here's our regular plea. Please let us know if there's someone that you think we should speak with. We would love to hear from you. Let's keep that conversation going.
When did we get here, and how your stories mean